The moment Celia Graves rode into Dusty Creek, Nevada, on a sweltering July afternoon in 1879, every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing and stared, because she was holding a baby against her chest with one arm and the reins of a half-dead mare with the other, and in her saddlebag, pressed flat against a worn leather Bible, was what remained of a land deed that had been more than half consumed by fire. The town of Dusty Creek was not a large place, nor was it a particularly welcoming one. It sat in a shallow valley between two dry ridges in the Nevada desert, about 40 miles east of Carson City, and it had been built up over the previous decade by cattle ranchers, railroad workers, and a handful of stubborn settlers who believed the land could be made to give something back if you pushed it hard enough. There was a general store run by a widow named Mabel Crane, a saloon called the Red Spur that did brisk business on weekends, a livery stable, a sheriff's office, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a row of maybe a dozen homes scattered in no particular pattern along either side of a single unpaved road that turned into a river of mud when it rained and a cloud of chalk dust when it did not. Celia pulled her mare to a stop in front of the general store because it was the first building she reached, and because the baby, a boy of about 4 months old with dark eyes and a furious temperament, had begun to cry again. She had been riding for 2 days out of a place called Holt Bend, which was a settlement that no longer existed in any meaningful way, because a man named Douglas Harlow had burned most of it down in a legal dispute that was, by Celia's accounting, no dispute at all but plain theft dressed up in paperwork. She swung down from the saddle with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from doing things alone out of necessity, settled the baby against her hip, looped the reins around the hitching post, and looked up to find 3 men staring at her from the steps of the store. One of them was old and toothless. One of them was young and slack-jawed. The third was Peter Barker. She did not know his name yet, of course. What she knew was that he was tall, somewhere in his late 20s, with dark brown hair that was a little too long under the brim of a well-worn hat, a jaw that needed a shave, and eyes the color of a shallow creek in autumn, some mix of green and gold and brown that shifted depending on how the light hit them. He was leaning against one of the porch posts with his arms crossed, wearing a faded denim shirt and a pair of leather suspenders over it, and he was watching her with an expression that was not unkind but was deeply uncertain, the way a man looks when he is trying to work out what kind of trouble just rode into his day. "Is there a well in this town?" Celia said, because the baby was crying and she needed water and she had no patience for the kind of slow social rituals that usually preceded a conversation in a place like this. The tall man pushed off the post. "Around the side of the livery," he said. "You want me to show you?" "I can find a livery stable," Celia said, and then because she was not entirely ungrateful and she could see he meant it kindly, she added, "Thank you." She led her mare toward the livery, and the baby cried, and the whole town watched. The livery man was a thick-armed fellow named Gus who took one look at the mare and winced. He told her the horse needed at least 3 days of rest and good feed, which was 3 days she was not sure she could afford, and he quoted her a price that was fair. She paid it with a small amount of coin from the pouch at her belt, and then she took the baby to the well and drew water and let the boy drink from the cup of her palm, which he did clumsily and with great enthusiasm, and she drank too, long and deep and grateful. When she turned around, the tall man from the porch was standing a few feet away, holding his hat in his hands. "Peter Barker," he said. "I work the Double Creek Ranch about 4 miles north of town. I'm not trying to be a nuisance." "You just look like you might need to know where a person can get a meal." Celia studied him for a moment. In her experience, men who said they were not trying to be a nuisance often were, but there was something in his posture that was different. He was not pushing toward her. He was not performing confidence or using it to crowd her. He was standing at a distance and offering information, which was a thing she had not encountered very often in the last several weeks. I have almost no money, she said, because she had learned that honesty about her situation was more efficient than pride. Mabel Crane at the general store usually feeds people who are in a hard way, Peter said. She does not call it charity, she calls it running a tab, but she does not always collect. It depends on the person. What kind of person does she collect from? The corner of his mouth moved. The kind who can pay and pretend they cannot. Celia looked down at the baby, who had stopped crying and was now staring at Peter with the solemn intensity that babies sometimes directed at strangers, as if they were conducting a private evaluation. His name is Eli, she said. He is 4 months old. He belongs to my sister, who died in March. Peter looked at the baby, and something shifted in his face, something that was not pity exactly but was close to it and was also close to understanding. I'm sorry, he said, and he said it like he meant it. So am I, Celia said. She went to Mabel Crane's store. Mabel was a broad woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and a disposition that was simultaneously businesslike and deeply maternal, which was a combination Celia found deeply reassuring. Mabel took one look at her, then at the baby, then at the general state of Celia's appearance, which included road dust in her hair and a burn mark on the cuff of her sleeve. And she sat them both down at a table in the back room and brought out bread and cold roasted chicken and a cup of milk for the baby, who was at the age where he was taking some solid food in addition to nursing. You passing through, Mabel said, sitting across from her with a cup of coffee, because she was a woman who gathered information directly rather than waiting for it to arrive. I am not sure yet, Celia said, which was the truth. She had come to Dusty Creek because it was the nearest town to the parcel of land she believed was rightfully hers, and she needed to talk to someone who knew the law or at least knew the land registry before she decided what to do next. What is your business in this county? Mabel asked. Celia reached into her saddlebag, which she had carried in from the livery, and drew out the burned deed. She set it on the table carefully, because the edges were fragile and broke away like ash if you handled them wrong. It was a property deed for 160 acres in the valley about 6 miles north of Dusty Creek, issued under the Homestead Act of 1862, and it had been registered to her father, Thomas Graves, in 1872. When Douglas Harlow had come to claim the land by force 3 weeks ago, he had burned their home and most of their documents, but Celia had grabbed the deed and run with it, and the fire had only caught the outer edges, leaving the central information intact, including the registration number and her father's name. Mabel looked at it for a long time. Your father's claim, she said. My father died last autumn, Celia said. He had no will, but I am his only living child. My sister Rose died in March and her husband before that. Eli is Rose's boy, which makes him my nephew and my responsibility. And this Harlow fellow. Douglas Harlow is a cattle rancher out of Elko who has been buying up small homesteads by force or fraud for 3 years. He hired a man named Cutter to come to our settlement, with papers claiming my father had sold the land to Harlow in 1877, which is not possible because my father would never have sold, and also because my father wrote to me in December of 1877 and made no mention of any sale. Cutter burned 3 homes. Mine was one of them. I got out with Eli and the mayor and this deed, and I have been riding toward the county land office in Carson City ever since. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Carson City is 40 miles west. I know that. But I need a place to stay while my horse rests, and I need to find someone who can tell me if there is a justice of the peace or a land registry representative in Dusty Creek or nearby, because I do not think I can make Carson City in my current state. Mabel folded her hands on the table. There is a circuit judge who comes through here every 6 weeks. He was here 2 weeks ago, which means he will not be back for a month. There is no land registry here, but there is a lawyer named Aldous Webb who has an office 2 doors down. He is not a brilliant man, but he knows the filing procedures and he is honest, which is rarer than brilliance in my experience. Thank you, Celia said. "You can stay in my back room tonight," Mabel said before Celia had asked. "There is a cot and a chest of drawers. It is not grand, but it is clean." Celia felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for a very long time. "I will accept that," she said quietly. "I will pay you back." "I know you will," Mabel said simply. That evening, after she had put Eli down on the cot surrounded by blankets rolled up along the edges so he would not roll off, Celia sat in the back doorway of the general store and looked out at the desert sky, which was doing what desert skies do at dusk in July, turning colors that seemed almost impossible, deep orange fading into purple, fading into a blue so dark it was almost black, and she let herself feel, for just a few minutes, the full weight of everything that had happened in the last several months. She was 26 years old. She had been educated, more than most women in her situation, because her father had believed in education and had sent her to a small school in Sacramento when she was 12, where she had spent 3 years learning reading, mathematics, and a little history before the money ran out and she had come back to the homestead. She was capable and she was not easily frightened, but she was also very tired in a way that went deeper than her bones. She heard footsteps and looked up to find Peter Barker standing at the edge of the alley holding 2 cups. "Coffee," he said. "Mabel told me you were out here. I hope that is not presumptuous." "Did she send you?" Celia said. "She suggested I might bring this out," he said, which is Mabel's way of instructing someone to do a thing while making it seem voluntary. Despite everything, Celia almost smiled. "You can sit down if you want," she said, because the coffee was real and the company did not seem unwelcome. He sat on the step below her, long legs stretched out into the alley, and handed her the cup. For a few minutes they were both quiet, which was something Celia appreciated, because most people felt obligated to fill silence with noise. "How long have you been working the Double Creek Ranch?" she asked eventually. "For years," he said. "I came out from Missouri when I was 24. My family had a farm outside of St. Louis, but there were 6 of us and not enough land to split further. My older brother got the farm, I came west." "Do you like it here?" He thought about that with what seemed like genuine consideration. "I like the land," he said. "The sky here is different than Missouri. It is bigger. Sometimes I think there is too much sky and not enough of everything else, but mostly I think it is honest. The land does not pretend to be something it is not." Celia looked out at the desert. "No," she said, "it does not." "What was your land like?" he asked. "The homestead." She was quiet for a moment, deciding how much to say and to whom. But the evening was warm and the coffee was good, and she was too tired for careful calculation. "It was a valley," she said. 6 miles north of here, actually. It had good water from a spring feed, and my father had been working it for 7 years. He had about 40 head of cattle and a wheat field that was finally producing well. There were cottonwood trees along the creek. Eli was born there in March, which is also when my sister died, and I buried Rose under one of the cottonwoods." She paused. "Harlow will cut those trees down. He cuts everything down." Peter was quiet for a moment. "I know that valley," he said. "We ran cattle past the north edge of it last spring." "Your father had a good fence line." He looked at her. "I did not know him personally. I am sorry." "He was a good man," Celia said. "Stubborn but good." The baby made a sound from inside, not crying but shifting in his sleep, and Celia rose automatically, the reflex of someone who had spent 4 months listening for that particular sound. "I should check on him," she said. Peter stood too. "I will be in town tomorrow morning if you need anything," he said. "We are picking up a supply order from Mabel. If you need someone to go with you to Aldous Webb's office, I am not a lawyer, but I know how to stand in a room and look like I will not be moved, which is sometimes more useful." Celia looked at him for a moment in the fading light. His offer was specific and practical, and carried no implication that she was helpless or needed rescuing. It was the offer of someone who had assessed a situation and identified where they might be useful. She appreciated the specificity of it. "I may take you up on that," she said. She went inside to Eli, and Peter Barker walked back toward the saloon, and the night settled over Dusty Creek in a thick, warm silence. Aldous Webb was a thin, nervous man of about 45 with spectacles that perpetually slid down his nose, and a habit of tapping his fingertips together when he was thinking. His office contained 3 chairs, a desk covered in papers, and 2 tall bookshelves crammed with legal texts, and it smelled of ink and old leather and the faint ghost of tobacco. He looked at the burned deed for a long time, turning it carefully in the morning light, and then he looked at Celia over his spectacles. "This registration number is valid," he said. "I can cross-reference it against the county records I have on file here, and if it matches, then you have a case. The fact that the deed is damaged does not invalidate it, provided the essential information is legible, which it is." "Harlow has papers claiming my father sold the land," Celia said. "When were they dated?" Cutter said 1877. Webb tapped his fingertips together. "If your father registered under the Homestead Act in 1872, he would have been required to live on and improve the land for 5 years before he could receive full title. That would put full title around 1877. It is possible but suspicious that a sale would have been arranged at exactly that moment." He paused. "It is also possible that those papers are forged." "They are forged," Celia said flatly. "I believe you," Webb said, in the mild tone of a man who was stating a professional assessment rather than offering personal allegiance. "The question is how to prove it. A forged document can be challenged, but it requires either a handwriting expert or a witness who can testify to the forgery, or evidence that the supposed transaction never took place, which might include letters, bank records, or sworn statements from people who knew your father." Peter, who was standing against the wall with his arms crossed precisely as he had offered, said, "The homesteaders at Holt Bend. The ones who were not burned out. They would have known Thomas Graves. They might be willing to give statements." Celia looked at him. "There are 3 families still at the settlement, the Murphys and the Delacroix family and an elderly man named Hartwell. They were not targeted because their parcels are smaller and do not border the creek." "Could you get statements from them?" Webb asked. "I could write to them. I do not know if they would come this far. Written statements notarized would be acceptable for the preliminary filing," Webb said. "What you need immediately is to file a counterclaim with the land registry in Carson City, formally contesting any transfer of title recorded under your father's name. Until that counterclaim is filed, Harlow's position strengthens every week. A judge will be more sympathetic to the party who acted promptly." "How long do I have?" Celia said. "The statute on this kind of dispute is vague," Webb said, with the careful honesty of a man who knew that vagueness was its own kind of danger. "But I would say no more than 30 days before Harlow's people move to formalize possession." Celia looked at Eli, who was sitting on her lap examining her buttons with deep concentration. 30 days. She had 3 days until her mare was fit to travel. Webb would need 2 days to prepare the proper filing papers. That left 25 days, which sounded like enough until you thought about the 40 miles to Carson City on a horse that was not fully recovered, with a 4-month-old baby, and the fact that she had almost no money. "I can pay you in work," she said to Webb. "Whatever filing fees and legal preparation you need, I will work off the debt. I can write, I can keep accounts, I can organize those papers of yours which, if you will permit me to say so, look like they are in urgent need of organization." Webb looked at his desk and had the grace to appear slightly embarrassed. "That would be acceptable," he said. She looked at Peter. He was watching her with that expression she was beginning to recognize. Not quite admiring and not quite amused, but something between the two. The look of a man who keeps encountering evidence that exceeds his expectations and is not sure what to do about it. "The Double Creek Ranch has a wagon going to Carson City on the 23rd, he said. "That is 6 days from now. My employer, Marcus Doyle, sends it in every month for supplies. If you need passage, I can ask him. He is not an unkind man." "Does he know you are making this offer on his behalf?" Celia asked. "No," Peter said simply, "but he will say yes." "How do you know?" "Because I will explain the situation to him, and he is a fair man. and also because I will offer to ride along and handle the supply run myself, which saves him sending one of the other hands. There was something so straightforward and unassuming about the way he solved problems that Celia found it almost disarming. He did not make grand gestures or attempt to position himself as her savior. He identified practical obstacles and addressed them practically. She had not encountered very many men who operated that way. "Ask him," she said. "I would appreciate it." The next 6 days passed in a rhythm that was not exactly comfortable but was purposeful, which for Celia was nearly the same thing. She organized Aldous Webb's office, which was a considerable undertaking that required 2 full days, and the rearrangement of approximately 400 documents into a system that made logical sense. Webb watched her work with the expression of a man who had given up on a problem so long ago that seeing someone solve it was mildly startling. She wrote 3 letters to the families at Holt Bend, explaining what she needed and asking for notarized statements regarding her father's character and his ownership of the land. She fed Eli and walked him in the evenings along the edge of town where the desert began, because the movement settled him, and she thought while she walked, planning and replanning the steps ahead of her. Peter came into town each morning with the ranch's supply requests and spent time at the store or the livery, and when their paths crossed, which happened more often than chance would fully account for, they talked. Not about important things at first, just the small currency of daily life, what the weather was doing, whether the creek was running low, how Eli had slept. But gradually, the conversations deepened in the way that conversations do when 2 people are both honest and curious by nature, and find that the other person rewards honesty with more honesty. She learned that he had come to Nevada with very little and had built himself into a reliable and valued ranch hand through sheer consistency, which was not the most dramatic story but was a true one. She learned that he read when he could get books, which was not often, and that he had opinions about things, carefully considered opinions that he did not push on others but would defend if asked. She learned that he had been engaged once, to a woman in Missouri named Clara, and that she had not wanted to come west and he had not wanted to stay east, and they had parted without much drama but with considerable sadness, and that had been 4 years ago and he had not found anyone since. He learned in turn that Celia had been engaged once too, briefly, to a man named Samuel Holt in Sacramento, who had been charming and then progressively less so, and she had ended it 6 months in when she recognized the pattern. He learned that she had chosen to come back to the homestead not out of lack of options, but out of genuine love for the land and for her father and for Rose, and that she did not regret it, even now. He learned that she was funny when she allowed herself to be, which was more often as the days passed, and that she laughed with her whole face, and that she had a habit when she was thinking hard of pressing her thumb against her lower lip, and that she was more afraid than she let on, not for herself but for Eli. On the 5th evening, they were sitting outside Mabel's store again, which had become a sort of unofficial gathering point, and Eli had fallen asleep against Celia's shoulder in that absolute way that very young babies sleep, as if unconsciousness were a decision made with the entire body. The town was quiet around them. A lamp burned in the saloon window across the street. Somewhere a horse shifted in the livery. "What happens if the filing does not work?" Peter said quietly enough that it was not a challenge but a real question. Celia was quiet for a moment. "I do not know exactly," she said. "I would have no legal claim to the land. Harlow would have possession. I would need to find somewhere else to go and something else to do." She paused. "But I am not ready to think about that yet. I prefer to work on what is in front of me." "That is a good way to be," he said. "It is the only way I know," she said. He was quiet again, and then he said, "You are the most self-possessed person I have met in a long time." Celia looked at him. There was something in his voice that was not just a compliment. It was an observation offered with a kind of wondering sincerity, as if he was still working out what to do with the fact of her. She felt something warm move through her chest that she recognized and immediately set aside because she had too much to handle right now to give that feeling any room to settle. "I had to be," she said. "There was no one else." "I know," he said. "I think that is what I mean." The next morning, the ranch wagon came into town for its monthly run to Carson City. Marcus Doyle, who was a heavy-set man of about 50 with a sun-baked face and an air of permanent practical authority, came into Webb's office himself and introduced himself to Celia and shook her hand and looked at the burned deed and listened to her explain the situation, and then he said, "You ride with my wagon. No charge. Peter can handle the supply run and make sure you get to the land registry office and back." He paused. "My father homesteaded in Kansas. Men like Harlow were why half the honest settlers out here had nothing to show for their work. I will not have it on my conscience that I did not help when I could." Celia thanked him, and she meant it deeply. The road to Carson City took most of a day in the wagon, through a landscape of pale dust and sage and distant mountains that shimmered in the July heat. Eli spent much of the journey in Celia's lap, alternating between sleeping and staring at the horses, with the fixed concentration of someone experiencing something miraculous, and Peter drove the wagon with the easy competence of a man who had done it many times. They talked on and off through the day, and the silences between conversations were comfortable rather than empty. Around midday, they stopped at a spring to water the horses and eat the food Mabel had packed for them, bread and hard cheese and dried apricots, and Peter held Eli while Celia ate, which she had asked him to do out of practical necessity, but watching him hold the baby was unexpectedly moving. He did it carefully and without awkwardness, settling the boy against his arm with the quiet competence of someone who had spent time around young children. Eli regarded him seriously for a moment, and then grabbed Peter's finger with the fierce purposefulness of babies, and Peter looked down at him with an expression that was gentle and a little undone. "He looks like he is deciding something," Peter said. "He usually is," Celia said. "He is a very decisive baby." "He gets that from his aunt," Peter said, and looked up at her with a small smile that did not try to be anything more than what it was. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she looked away at the mountains, and neither of them said anything about that moment, but both of them knew it was there. The land registry office in Carson City was a busy, paper-thick government building staffed by 2 clerks who looked perpetually harassed. Celia presented the burned deed, the registration number, and the counterclaim documents that Webb had prepared, and she argued her case with the quiet precision of someone who had thought it through many times and knew exactly what she needed to say. The senior clerk, a thin man named Hargreaves, examined the deed under a glass and confirmed that the registration number matched their records for the Thomas Graves parcel. "You are filing a formal objection to any recorded transfer under this parcel number," Hargreaves said, writing as he spoke. "Any claim by a Douglas Harlow or his representatives will be flagged pending resolution by a circuit judge. This does not restore your possession of the land, but it prevents Harlow from formalizing his claim until the matter is heard." "When will it be heard?" Celia said. "The circuit judge for this district is Judge Alderman. He holds court in Carson City every 60 days. The next session is in September." Hargreaves looked at her. "You will need a lawyer present." "I have Aldous Webb of Dusty Creek," she said. Hargreaves nodded. "Webb is competent," he said, in the tone of a man offering the highest compliment available. She filed everything. She paid the small filing fee with the last of the coin in her pouch. She walked out of the land registry office into the bright Carson City afternoon and stood on the board walkway and took a long breath. Peter was waiting outside with Eli, sitting on a bench with the baby on his knee, showing him the silver button on his shirt cuff, which Eli was attempting to eat. He looked up when she came out. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "We are filed. September hearing." He looked at her face and seemed to read something there that she had not said aloud. "That is good," he said, with a kind of quiet steadiness that she was coming to rely on. "That is very good, Celia." It was one of the few times he had used her given name, and it landed differently than she expected. The ride back to Dusty Creek was quieter, partly because Eli slept through most of it, and partly because both of them had things they were thinking about that were not quite ready to be spoken. The sun went down somewhere west of the mountains, and the desert went cool and purple, and the stars came out one by one and then all at once. And by the time they rolled into town, it was full dark and the red spur was lit up with lamplight and the sound of a badly tuned piano. Peter helped her down from the wagon and handed her Eli, who woke briefly, looked around at the darkness with philosophical acceptance, and went back to sleep. There was a moment on the street outside Mabel's store, with the lamp burning in the window behind them and the stars very bright overhead, when they stood close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, and something passed between them that was not yet a declaration but was no longer pretending to be nothing. "Thank you," she said. "For today, for all of it. You did the work," he said. "I just drove the wagon." "Peter," she said, and he went still in the way that people go still when they hear their name said a particular way. "Why are you helping me?" He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight his face was honest and a little open, the face of a man who had thought about a question before it was asked. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because I wanted to." "Those are different answers," she said. "Yes," he said, "they are." She went inside. He drove the wagon back to the ranch. But she lay on the cot in Mabel's back room with Eli asleep beside her, and found that she was smiling at the ceiling for the first time in a very long time. The weeks between the filing and the September hearing were not idle ones. Celia established herself in Dusty Creek with the kind of quiet competence that changes how people think about a newcomer. She worked for Webb in the mornings, which paid for her room and board, and in the afternoons she helped Mabel in the store, which Mabel claimed she did not need but clearly did. She wrote 3 more letters to Holt Bend and received 2 back, one from the Murphy family and one from Old Hartwell, both containing detailed accounts of Thomas Graves's ownership and character, which Webb notarized and added to the case file. She also learned things about Dusty Creek. She learned that it was a town with more grievances than glory, that several of the small ranchers north of town had lost parcels to Harlow's operation over the past 2 years and had not known what to do about it. She spoke to 2 of them, a quiet man named Silas Green and a family named Beckett with a teenage son, and she found that their experiences mirrored her own, same tactics, different names, always a document that appeared from nowhere, and a man named Cutter in the background. She mentioned this to Webb, and Webb's eyes went sharp behind his spectacles. "If there are multiple fraudulent transactions," he said, "that is no longer a land dispute. That is a criminal conspiracy." "Can we bring that to the judge in September?" Celia said. "We can try," Webb said. "It would be a stronger case. We would need the other claimants to file as well, and we would need testimony." "I think they would," Celia said. "They are angry and they were not sure anyone would listen." "Well," Webb said, with the satisfied expression of a man watching a complicated puzzle resolve itself, "they have a lawyer who will listen now." Peter came into town most mornings, and they had coffee on Mabel's steps and talked, and the conversations had shifted now into something that was neither quite friendship nor quite courtship, but contained elements of both. He had started bringing things, a book he had found in the ranch bunkhouse that he thought she might like, a small cloth rabbit that one of the ranch hands had made for his own daughter and set aside, which Eli immediately claimed as his most treasured possession. He brought these things without ceremony, setting them down and talking about something else, in the manner of a man who wanted to give things but did not want to make a production of it. One afternoon in early August, she went out to the Double Creek Ranch with Mabel, who was delivering a supply order and had offered to take Celia along, and Celia saw for the first time the landscape that Peter lived in. The ranch was well kept, a substantial operation with a solid main house, a long bunkhouse, several working outbuildings, and a horse pasture that ran along the northern edge of the property. The surrounding land was beautiful in the high desert way, not lush but powerful, with views in 3 directions and the sky enormous overhead. Marcus Doyle met them outside and showed them around with the pride of a man who had built something real. And while Mabel and Doyle discussed the supply account, Peter walked Celia to the edge of the horse pasture, where a line of cottonwoods marked a seasonal creek. "Your father's land is about 2 miles that way," he said, pointing southeast toward a gap in the ridgeline. She looked in that direction for a long moment. The air smelled of sage and dry grass and faintly of the cottonwoods. "Can we see it?" she said. They saddled 2 horses because hers was fully recovered by then and Peter had a steady gelding, and they rode 2 miles south and east through open country until the valley opened up ahead of them and she saw it. She had not been back since the fire, and the sight of it hit her harder than she had expected. The house was gone, just a scorched foundation and some standing chimney stones. The wheat field was ruined. But the creek was still running, bright and steady through its channel, and the cottonwoods were still there, enormous and green in the dry summer heat. And one of them, the largest, had a low branch where her father had tied a rope swing 30 years ago that had long since rotted away but left a scar in the bark. She sat on her horse and looked at it and did not cry, because she had done her crying in private, and there was no more room for it right now. But she felt the loss of it in her chest like a hand pressing down. Peter did not say anything. He sat his horse beside her in silence and let her look, and she was grateful for that silence in a way that was almost physical. "I am going to get it back," she said finally. "I know," he said. She looked at him then sideways, and the late afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the valley around them, turning everything gold and warm and momentary, and his face in that light was patient and sure, and she thought with a sudden clarity that surprised her that she was falling in love with this man. Not the quick, violent falling of early infatuation, but the slower, deeper falling that happens when you have watched someone be themselves for a month and found that their self is something you want to be near. She did not say anything about that. She turned her horse back toward the ranch. But she carried the knowledge of it with her, careful and private, like something that needed a little more time before it could bear the weight of being spoken. In late August, 2 weeks before the September hearing, Douglas Harlow came to Dusty Creek. He came with 3 men, which was the number of men a person brought when they wanted to intimidate without quite threatening, and he rode a very fine horse, which was the kind of horse a man rode when he wanted to establish that he was a man of consequence. He was perhaps 55, with silver hair and a broad, weathered face, and the particular expression of a man who had spent many years deciding that his own convenience was a moral priority. He went to Aldous Webb's office first, which was where Celia was when he arrived, and he came in without knocking, which was also a kind of message, and he looked at Celia with the evaluating coldness of a man who was trying to work out whether she was a real problem or an irritant that could be managed. "Miss Graves," he said, as if he were conferring her name on her, "I understand you have filed some papers in Carson City." "I have," Celia said. She did not stand up because she was sitting at Webb's desk doing his accounts, and she had no intention of standing for this man. "You are wasting your time and the court's time," Harlow said. "Your father sold me that land and I have the papers to prove it." "Your papers are forgeries," Celia said, pleasantly but without heat, the way she might state any factual matter. "I look forward to demonstrating that to Judge Alderman in September." Harlow's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. He had expected something different from her, perhaps tears, perhaps backing down, perhaps the particular performance of feminine helplessness that certain men interpreted as an invitation to be magnanimous. He had not expected calm, specific opposition. "Miss Graves," he said, and his voice had dropped half a note, not a threat exactly but the prelude to one. "I am not without means to make this difficult for you." "I am sure you are not," she said. "But I have filed with the land registry, and I have witnesses, and I have a lawyer, and I have a court date, and I intend to be present for all of it." "Good afternoon, Mr. Harlow." He stood for a moment as if he were considering whether to continue, and then he left. Webb, who had been very still during this exchange, let out a breath. "That was either very brave or very inadvisable," he said. "Probably both," Celia said, and turned back to the accounts. That evening she told Peter about it, and his jaw tightened in the way she had seen it tighten when something bothered him, a slight set to the muscle that he usually controlled but could not entirely. "He will try something before September," Peter said. "Men like Harlow do not come to town personally unless they are worried, and a worried man like Harlow is dangerous." "I know," Celia said. "But what he can do is limited now. The filing is on record. If anything happens to me or to my witnesses before the hearing, that only strengthens the case for fraud." "That is cold comfort," he said. "It is the only comfort available," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want you to be careful, Celia." There was something in the way he said it, not the careful of a man giving practical advice, but the careful of a man who had a personal stake in her continued well-being, and she looked at him directly and saw that he was not trying to hide it. "I will be," she said. "You be careful, too." Something shifted between them then, something that had been building for weeks and was now close enough to the surface that ignoring it required active effort. He reached out and took her hand, just briefly, just a moment, his fingers folding around hers in the lamplight, and she did not pull away. Then Eli made a noise from the back room, and the moment passed, and she went to check on the baby, and Peter sat quietly on the step for a few minutes longer before he walked back to his horse and rode out to the ranch. But she felt his hand around hers for the rest of the evening. Nothing dramatic happened in the 2 weeks before the hearing, which Celia supposed was its own kind of victory. Harlow's men rode through town twice more, slow, deliberate rides that were meant to be noticed, and people noticed them. But no one was threatened directly, and nothing was damaged. What did happen was that Silas Green and the Beckett family formally submitted their own counterclaims with Webb's help, and their documentation was added to what was becoming, as Webb put it with quiet satisfaction, a fairly compelling narrative of systematic fraud. Peter came every morning and they had coffee and talked, and the talk was increasingly about the future rather than the past, small prospective things. What the land would look like once it was restored, what Eli would be like when he was old enough to walk, whether the creek on the Graves parcel would recover well enough to support the cattle she wanted to run. He listened to her plans with complete seriousness and offered thoughts where he had them, and she did the same for his, and it was the conversation of two people who were already, without quite having said so, building something together in their minds. One evening about a week before the hearing, they went for a walk to the edge of town where the desert began and the stars were enormous, and they walked side by side in the warm dark, and he reached over and took her hand properly this time. No ambiguity about it, his fingers lacing through hers, and she held on and did not let go. "Celia," he said, and she could feel the word in his chest even though she was not leaning against him. "Peter," she said, because she wanted to say his name the way he had said hers. "I want you to know something," he said, "before the hearing, in case it matters, in case the hearing goes in a direction that changes your plans about where you are going." She waited. "I am not asking you to stay in Dusty Creek because of the land," he said carefully, the words chosen as carefully as she had ever heard him choose them. "I am asking you to consider staying because I would like you to, because I have not felt the way I feel when I am around you in a very long time, and I would not like to go back to not feeling it." She stopped walking. The desert was wide and dark around them, and the town was a cluster of warm lights behind them, and the stars were the kind of stars you only saw far from other people's lights. "I would like to stay," she said. "I have been trying not to want that too much, in case the hearing goes badly and I have nothing here." "You have me here," he said, with the directness that she had come to love about him. "Whatever happens with the land." She turned toward him, and he was close in the darkness, and she reached up and touched his jaw, the rough stubble of it warm under her fingertips, and he went very still in the way people go still when they are trying to make something last. "Peter," she said softly. "Yes," he said, as if that were an answer to a question. She kissed him, or he kissed her, or they moved toward each other simultaneously in the dark with the stars overhead and the sage smell of the desert around them. And it was the kind of kiss that was both exactly what she had expected and entirely more than that, warm and certain and long. And when they finally pulled back, he kept her face in his hands like he was not quite ready to let go. "Well," she said when she could speak. "Well," he agreed, and there was wonder in his voice. They walked back to town holding hands, and the warmth of that walk stayed with her through the night. The September hearing was held in Carson City, in a county courtroom that smelled of wood polish, and the particular anxiety of people with things to prove. Celia sat at the petitioner's table with Aldous Webb beside her and the burned deed in a protective folder in front of her. And beside that folder, the notarized statements from the Murphy family and old Hartwell. And beside those, the filed claims from Silas Green and the Becketts, and a third homesteader named Abner Cruz who had come forward at the last moment with his own story of forged papers. Peter sat in the gallery behind her with Eli on his knee, and she could feel his presence there the way you feel the warmth of something close even when you are not looking at it. Douglas Harlow sat at the respondent's table with a city lawyer from Reno named Brighton who wore a very good suit and had the polished confidence of a man who usually won. Judge Alderman was a compact, silver-haired man in his 60s with the face of someone who had spent 40 years listening to people tell him things and had become very good at distinguishing the true from the false. He read everything first, both sets of documents, without speaking, and the courtroom was silent while he read. Then he asked questions. He asked Celia about the history of the homestead, about her father's death, about the events at Holt Bend. She answered everything directly and without embellishment. He asked Webb to explain the structural problems with Harlow's documents, and Webb did so with the careful precision of a man in the best hour of his professional life. Brighton argued for Harlow with considerable skill, pointing out that the supposed sale had been documented and that the damage to the original deed made verification difficult, and that without a clear chain of title going back to her father's death, Celia's claim was circumstantial. Judge Alderman listened to all of it. He called for a recess. He was gone for an hour. When he came back, he looked at both tables and said, "The handwriting analysis I ordered on Mr. Harlow's documentation, which I should tell you was conducted by an expert engaged by this court in advance of this hearing, indicates that the signature attributed to Thomas Graves on the supposed deed of sale does not match the signature on the original 1872 registration document, which this court has in its records. The discrepancy is significant and not attributable to natural variation. The room was very quiet. Additionally," Judge Alderman continued, "I find the pattern of transactions presented by the multiple claimants in this hearing to be consistent with a coordinated scheme to defraud homesteaders of their legally registered parcels. This is not a matter that ends with today's hearing. I am referring the matter of criminal fraud to the district prosecutor's office for formal investigation." He looked at Harlow without apparent emotion. "In the meantime, I am ruling in favor of the petitioner. The parcel registered under the name of Thomas Graves, and now claimed by his daughter and heir Celia Graves, is hereby restored to its rightful holder, Mr. Harlow's claim is rejected, and his documentation is declared invalid." He brought his gavel down. The sound of it moved through Celia's chest like a bell. She sat still for a moment, because the verdict had been what she worked for and argued for and believed was just, but hearing it said aloud by a judge in a formal court was something different from believing it in her heart, and she needed a moment to let it settle into real. Then Webb was shaking her hand and saying something she did not quite hear, and she turned around in her chair and found Peter standing in the gallery with Eli in his arms and his face bright with something that was not just gladness for her, but also, unmistakably, gladness for himself. and she got up from the table and walked through the low gate, and he put his free arm around her and she held on. "You did it," he said against her hair. "We did it," she said. Eli, pressed between them, made a sound of mild protest, and they both laughed, and the formality of the courtroom dissolved around them into something ordinary and warm and irreplaceably good. Harlow left the courtroom with Brighton without speaking to anyone. The criminal investigation that the judge had referred would proceed slowly, as such things did, but it would proceed, and over the following months Cutter, the man who had actually conducted the burnings and the threats, would be brought in for questioning, and his testimony, given in exchange for reduced charges, would be sufficient to bring a fraud case against Harlow that would eventually result in his land holdings being examined and several of his fraudulent acquisitions being unwound. It was not swift justice, but it was justice, and Celia found that she was content to let it work through its proper channels now that hers was settled. The ride back to Dusty Creek from Carson City was the best of the 3 trips she had made on that road. The sky was the brilliant blue of early September, still warm but with the first suggestion of autumn in the air, and the sage was that dusty silver green it turned in the dry end of summer, and Eli had discovered that if he shouted, the sound of it disappeared into the enormous space around them without echoing, and he found this deeply interesting and did it repeatedly. And Peter drove the wagon, and she sat beside him, and their shoulders touched with the movement of the road, and the whole world felt like an opening rather than a closing. She moved back to the homestead at the end of September. It was a project, not a return to something intact, but the beginning of building something new on the bones of what had been there before. The foundation of the original house was solid and could be built upon. The wheat field was ruined for this season, but the soil was good and would come back. The cattle were gone, sold off by Harlow's man before the ruling, but Marcus Doyle lent her 2 cows against a future repayment, which she accepted with gratitude and the firm intention of repaying it. Peter came every evening after his work at the ranch was done. He came with tools or with food, or sometimes with just himself and the capacity to work alongside her without needing to direct or manage or take over, which was the kind of help she could accept without it costing her anything she wanted to keep. They rebuilt the front wall of the house in October, sourcing timber from a mill in Carson City that Webb helped her arrange on credit. Silas Green came out for 2 weekends with his adult son and helped with the roofing, because that was the kind of community that could exist in places like this if you worked to build it. Eli sat in his cloth bouncer in the corner of whatever room they were working in and watched the proceedings with the attitude of a small supervisor, and Peter would talk to him while they worked, narrating what he was doing in the serious tone you use with someone who is paying close attention, and Eli would respond with sounds that seemed intended as genuine commentary, and the exchange of it made Celia laugh every time. One evening in late October, when the house was mostly enclosed and a fire was burning in the rebuilt fireplace, and Eli was asleep in the back room, Celia and Peter sat on the front step together in the cold, clear night air, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat quietly and looked out at the valley that was hers. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the considered quiet she recognized as him finding the right words for something important. "I have been thinking that I do not want to keep riding out here every evening and then riding back to the ranch at night," he said. "I have been thinking that I would like to be here all the time, not as a visitor." She lifted her head from his shoulder so she could see his face. The firelight from the window caught one side of it, warm and steady. "Are you asking me something?" she said. "I am trying to," he said, with the small, rueful smile he used when he was embarrassed and not trying to hide it. "I do not have a ring. I had not planned to do this tonight specifically. It is just that tonight seems like the right time, or my patience ran out. I am not entirely sure which." She reached up and took his face in her hands the way she had that night in the desert. "Peter Barker," she said. "Ask me what you are trying to ask me." "Will you marry me?" he said, looking straight at her with those autumn-colored eyes that she had been looking at for 4 months and was not remotely tired of. "Will you let me be here, with you and Eli? Will you let me be part of this?" She kissed him before she answered, which she recognized was not technically an answer but felt like one, and when she pulled back she said, "Yes, yes to all of it." He pulled her against him with both arms, and she could feel the breath go out of him like relief, like a man setting down a weight he has been carrying with great care. And she held on to him in the fire-lit dark with the stars brilliant overhead, and the valley spread out below them, and thought that she had not known 3 months ago, when she rode into Dusty Creek with a burned deed, and a baby, that this was what she was riding toward. But she was deeply glad that she had ridden here anyway. They were married in November, at the small church in Dusty Creek that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, in a ceremony performed by the circuit minister who came through every month. Mabel Crane was there and wept with the satisfied emotion of a woman who had done her part in making a thing happen. Aldous Webb was there, looking unexpectedly moved behind his spectacles. Marcus Doyle attended and shook Peter's hand for a long time and told Celia with great seriousness that she was getting a good man, and she said she knew it. Silas Green was there, and the Beckett family, and old Hartwell, who had made the trip from Holt Bend specifically for the occasion and arrived looking pleased with himself. Eli sat in Mabel's arms through the ceremony and watched everything with those dark, evaluating eyes. And at the moment when Celia and Peter spoke their vows, he made a loud and approving sound that caused a ripple of laughter through the small congregation, and which Peter later said he was counting as Eli's blessing of the union. After the ceremony there was food at the church, contributed by most of the town in the communal way of small places, and there was someone with a fiddle who played well enough for dancing, and Celia danced with her husband for the first time in the warm November evening with the desert cold pressing at the church windows and the lamp light golden inside, and she thought, this is a life. Not the life she had planned or predicted, but a real one, built from what was here. Peter carried her across the threshold of the rebuilt house that night, and Eli, settled in his new room, slept through until morning for the first time in his young life, as if he too had decided that things were finally settled enough to rest. The winter was cold and clear, the high desert kind of cold that was dry and absolute, and the three of them settled into the rhythms of the homestead with the particular pleasure of people building something together on purpose. Peter had left the Double Creek Ranch with Marcus Doyle's blessing and a handshake, and the open invitation to come back if things did not work out, which both men knew they would. He took on the operation of the Graves homestead, which he and Celia ran together, because she had no interest in handing over control of her land, and he had no interest in her doing so, and they made decisions about the cattle and the fields together across the kitchen table in the mornings while Eli sat in his high chair eating mashed food with the methodical focus of someone performing important work. She planted winter wheat in November, after the first frost had broken the soil the right way, and the field came up green in February, tentative and certain at the same time. They ran 15 head of cattle by spring, between Doyle's loan and 3 animals Celia bought at a sale in Carson City, using the wages she had earned at Webb's office. The creek ran clear and cold through the cottonwoods. The chimney drew well, and the house was warm. Old Hartwell came to visit in February and stayed a week, and during that week he helped Peter with the fence line along the south pasture, and told stories about Thomas Graves that Celia had not heard, small stories about who her father had been when he was young and building this land, and she listened to all of them carefully and stored them away to tell Eli when he was old enough to hear them. In the spring, she planted a kitchen garden behind the house, and Peter built her a proper gate for it, good cedar posts and wrought iron hinges he had ordered from a blacksmith in Carson City. He also planted a new rope swing on the big cottonwood by the creek, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had noticed the scar on the bark and understood what it meant. And the first time Celia saw it, she had to stand still for a moment with her back to him until she could compose herself. "You found the old mark," she said. "I thought Eli might want to swing someday," he said simply. She turned around and he saw her face and crossed the yard and held her, and she let him, which was something she was still learning to do, to let herself be held when she needed it rather than managing her feelings alone in the dark. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," he said. "I would have wanted him to." Eli took his first steps in April, in the kitchen, catching himself on the table leg with an expression of such pure triumph that both Celia and Peter broke into applause, which startled the baby into sitting down hard, and then he laughed at his own sitting down, and the three of them were in stitches on the kitchen floor for several minutes. The spring and summer were good ones. The wheat field produced a first harvest that was modest but real, something to build from. The cattle were healthy. The reputation of the Graves homestead, which Celia had quietly decided to call by its old name but also by its new one, the Barker Graves place, depending on who was asking, was one of an honest and well-managed operation. Peter made friends in the community, which was something he did quietly and without trying, the way people do who are genuinely interested in other people rather than in what those people can provide. He knew the weather patterns and the land in a way that made him useful to the other small ranchers, and he helped when he could and asked for help when he needed it. And Celia watched him build himself into the fabric of the place, with the same kind of steady work he brought to everything. In August, she realized she was expecting a child, and she told Peter at breakfast one morning with the same directness with which she told him everything, sitting across the table with her coffee cup in her hands and looking him in the face. He sat very still for a moment, and she could not read him, and then his face broke into something that was not quite a smile and not quite something else but was both at once, the face of a man receiving something he had wanted and is now a little overwhelmed by having. "When?" he said. "February, I think," she said. He came around the table and he took her hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and sat down next to her rather than across from her and kept her hands in his. And they sat like that for a while in the morning kitchen while Eli threw porridge at the table in small arcs, and the September light came through the window, and the wheat field stood golden outside. The criminal case against Douglas Harlow concluded in October of that year. Cutter testified to the scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence, and Harlow was formally charged with land fraud and arson. And after a trial in the spring of 1880, he was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in the state penitentiary. 3 of the fraudulently acquired parcels, including those claimed from Celia Green and Abner Cruz, were unwound and returned to their original holders. It was not every injustice corrected, because no legal process corrects every injustice, but it was specific and real, and it mattered to the people who had lost what they had built. Celia attended one day of the trial, with Eli on her hip and Peter beside her in the gallery, and she watched Harlow receive his sentence with the calm attention of someone settling a long account. She did not feel triumph exactly, more a kind of clearing, the specific relief of a thing finally being named for what it was. On the way home, Peter said, "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like I can stop looking over my shoulder," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "You can look forward instead." She reached across the wagon seat and took his hand. The baby was born in February, a boy they named Thomas after her father, with a pair of lungs that registered his opinion of the world immediately and emphatically, and a quantity of dark hair that Peter observed was clearly from his mother's side. The birth was attended by Mabel Crane, who had delivered a number of babies in her time and was matter-of-fact and warm in equal measure. And it went well enough, though Celia was exhausted for a week afterward in a way she had not expected. Peter was careful and attentive in a way that did not feel like hovering, bringing her food and sitting with Thomas in the middle of the night so she could sleep in stretches, and reading to Eli in the evenings in a low voice so the house was quiet and warm. She watched him hold Thomas, this man who had come into her life in the summer of a very hard year, and thought that love was a complicated and multiple thing, that it made room for everyone it needed to make room for. Thomas was, as babies sometimes are, louder and more opinionated than the child who came before. Eli, who was now almost 2, observed his cousin and apparent new sibling with philosophical tolerance, occasionally patting the baby's head with the gentle inaccuracy of a toddler attempting tenderness. And Thomas accepted this with the resignation of a person who has already concluded that his circumstances, though imperfect, are probably not going to change. Mabel came to visit in March and stayed for 3 days, helping with the house and holding Thomas while Celia recovered her strength fully. And one afternoon she sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and looked around at the rebuilt house and the sound of Peter's voice coming from the yard where he was talking to Eli while fixing a fence post, and she said, "You know, when you rode into town, I thought you were going to be trouble." "I was trouble," Celia said. "Yes," Mabel said with great satisfaction. "The good kind." Aldous Webb came to dinner in the spring and ate everything put in front of him, and played with Thomas and made Eli laugh by making his spectacles rise and fall on his nose. And he told Celia that the organization she had imposed on his office 18 months ago had saved him considerable amounts of time, and that he had maintained it ever since. "I should have paid you more," he said. "You gave me the framework to get my land back," she said. "That was payment enough." Summer came again, the second one on the restored homestead, and the wheat field was productive, and the cattle were healthy, and the creek ran well through the cottonwoods. And Eli walked and then climbed everything in his path. And Thomas grew from a furious newborn into a furious baby with opinions about everything. And Peter worked the land with Celia every day, decision by decision and season by season. And in the evenings, they sat on the front step of the house that had been rebuilt from its own foundation, and watched the desert light chain, and talked about the day, and made plans for the next one. He had not known, when he leaned against a porch post in Dusty Creek and watched a woman ride in holding a baby and a burned deed, that his life was about to become something substantially different from and better than what it had been. She had not known either, when she pulled her half-dead mare to a stop and asked where the well was, that the answer would come from the man she would build a life with. But that was, she reflected one evening on the step with his arm around her and both boys asleep inside, and the stars doing their impossible nightly work overhead, the nature of things you do not plan for. They come at the moment you are least expecting them, when you are tired and afraid and holding something burned, and they turn out to be exactly what was needed. Peter pressed his lips to her temple, the casual, everyday tenderness that she had come to treasure as much as the grand moments. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking about next spring," she said. "I want to expand the wheat field to the north section, and I want to add another room to the house before winter." "Another room," he said. She looked at him with a deliberate composure she did not entirely feel. "Eli needs his own room properly," she said, "and Thomas needs his. And if there is going to be a third child by next spring, which I believe there is, then we will need the space." He was very still for a moment. "A third," he said. "I think so," she said. He turned to look at her fully, and she saw the same expression she had seen at the breakfast table when she told him about Thomas, that overwhelmed gladness that his face did not quite know what to do with. "Celia," he said. "Yes," she said. "You are extraordinary," he said. She laughed, full-faced and genuine, the way she had learned to laugh again over the past year and a half. "I am practical," she said, "which is why I told you now, so we can plan the room." "You can be both," he said, and kissed her properly. And the desert night settled around them, warm and wide and full of stars. And in the cottonwoods along the creek, the night birds were beginning their evening conversation. And the house behind them was full of sleeping children and the smell of the day's cooking, and the accumulated warmth of people who had made a place together. She had ridden into Dusty Creek with a burned deed, and a baby nobody was ready for in the summer of 1879, and she had found, in the particular combination of her own determination and the generosity of a few good people, and the love of one very specific man, not just the land she had come to reclaim, but everything that grew on it, the life she had not known she was riding toward. The third child came the following March, another boy, and they named him for Peter's father, James, and he was born in the house that had been rebuilt on the foundation of the original, in the valley with the cottonwoods and the clear creek. And Eli, who was 3 by then, stood in the doorway of the room and peered at the new baby with an expression of mingled curiosity and resignation. And Thomas, who was 1.5, sat on the floor with his cloth rabbit and watched everything with the careful dark eyes that were so much like his mother's. Peter held James in the first hour of his life and looked at Celia over the baby's head with that particular expression she had come to know as his version of the deepest things, and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Mabel Crane went home that evening and told anyone who would listen that the Barker Graves place was a fine example of what the country could be, which was a generous thing to say, and also, as things went in Dusty Creek, Nevada, in 1881, simply the truth. The valley bloomed every spring and dried every summer, and the creek ran clear, and the cottonwoods turned gold in October, and the house was full and warm, and there was always work to do, and always, at the end of the day, the step outside and the stars and the man beside her. And that was everything Celia Graves had ever actually needed, though she had not known it until she found it in the last place she had looked.